Well, both my parents were very good friends of W.R., which is William Randolph Hearst, and Marion Davies. And we would get invited up to the ranch quite frequently. At first, both my father and my mother and us. But then my mother and father got divorced when I was 5. So then Marion, who was my mother's best friend, invited her and us up frequently to get away from all the lurid details of the court battle that was, put out in all the newspapers. And
The court battle
about divorce.
King and Eleanor's
Eleanor
divorce.
getting a divorce, yeah.
Right.
And so, of course, the newspapers make the most of those things. So anyway, we would go up there for a long weekend, a week or two or something like that. And
How would you travel up there? Because we have to remember different
we drove, and although he had a private plane and he would fly people up, kind of important people, fly them up from Los Angeles up to San Luis Obispo, was the closest town. But he had his own landing field at San Simeon, besides, miles and acres of pastures and for all sorts of animals. He had a huge zoo there with elephants and camels and gnus and tigers and lions and zebras and everything. So that was a lot of fun to visit those also. Once I saw one of the guests. He always had many famous guests, not just from Hollywood, but from all around the world. They would always play tennis, in those days. And so I saw this man come up to one of the orangutans in a cage and kind of poked his tennis racket at him. And the orangutan grabbed the tennis racket and snapped it in two. And that was the end of that one. So also, they would go out on rides. The adults would go out on these rides that would last all day or all morning, and then they would set up camp where they were given a huge feast. It was like a so-called picnic, but it was, everything you can imagine. And then tents to rest in. And W.R. would, so he was raised on a ranch, so he would make it hard on his, soft-bottom guests, and ride all morning, and they'd stop and they'd eat, and then instead of, they'd all be exhausted and want to rest, no, they'd get back on the horse and go the next few miles and ride, and then till dinner, and they get off, and then they wanted to rest again and go to sleep. No, they have to go on again. He would drive them pretty hard.
So
but anyway, we were up there. I remember one Easter, so we had an Easter egg hunt in one of the gardens. They had many gardens around. We would stay in a villa. They called it a cabin or something. He always trying to keep it as a ranch, which was funny because it was, he had been to Europe many times, and he would see a beautiful little church or something, and he'd buy it and dismantle it and mark every stone of it, number it, and ship it to California, and then they would unpack it and rebuild it. So he had lots of very incredibly beautiful antiques, and so we stayed in a so-called cabin with a very enormous bed of Louis the 14th or 15th. Anyway, he was the King of France, so he had that thing there too. So the guests would all party in the evening, or they'd have skits, or they'd see movies. So they were up late, so they slept late. But my sister and I, we were about 5 and 3, or maybe 6 and 4, or something like that, and our French governess, we'd go in at ordinary time to eat breakfast, 7 in the morning or something, when nobody was up yet. So, and we'd be sitting at the end of this enormously long refectory table, which could hold 40 people, and they had huge velvet, red velvet plush chairs, So here we were, these 3 little people at one end of the table, in this, it looked very much like a cathedral, very high ceilings, and high up on the walls were these ancient medieval flags that were sort of in tatters, but really real flags, and made the whole thing look a little bit like a cathedral. But he always kept ketchup and mustard on the table and paper napkins in order to call it a ranch and make it look like a ranch. The guests weren't allowed to dress for dinner, but they did all sorts of costume parties and skits with costumes and that kind of thing. And then outside there's a beautiful outdoor pool, looking like a Greek building with columns all the way around, black and white tiles, and that was fun. We would swim in there with the guests, but they also had an indoor pool, or pools. This one pool would go around corners into different rooms, so we really enjoyed that. We'd swim from one room to another room, So
what was that like? I mean, it must have been damp in the rooms, or the echo. What was that like?
Yes, it echoed, and it had a strange smell. It was probably something to keep the water clean or something. But I remember that smell very well, and it was all beautiful colored tile, all very, very gorgeous, and I guess that was for days when it rained or whatever, or maybe at nighttime they swam in there, but we were always alone in there, and there were never anybody there to to swim with us outdoors. Yeah, there were plenty of people outdoors, so we had a lot of fun just roaming around.